Hello again, and welcome to the Interchange Book 3 video for Unit 14. And today we are talking about the passive voice, and specifically the passive voice to describe a process. Alright, so let's get started. So, in the active voice, what is the first step to creating a building? Right? The process of creating a building, what's the first thing that we do? Well, the architect designs the building, right? Now this is the active voice because I use the doer first because the architect is the person or the thing in the sentence doing the verb and designs is my verb. So we call the architect the doer. It's doing the verb. And the building, well, the building is receiving this action. It's receiving the verb from the architect. So we call this the receiver, right? And that's the active voice. When I use the doer, the verb, and then I use the receiver. But today we're using the passive voice. So remember, the passive voice, we start with the receiver. And then we always change the verb in the passive voice, and we use be and a past participle of the main verb, of the principal verb. Then it's optional, but we can say who is doing it when we say by the doer. So this sentence, the architect designs the building. In the passive voice, it reads, the building is designed by the architect. Okay? Like we said, this is not always necessary. I can just say the building is designed, right? If I say what's the first step to creating a building? Well, the building is designed, and I don't need to use the second part, this part that tells me who is doing it. Why? Because the receiver is the most important part of this sentence. That's what I want to talk about. So why do we use the passive voice? Well, for those reasons. First, it's not important what is doing the action, right? Again, we use this for describing a process sometimes. We're not saying who is doing it, but we want to say what is done. For example, using the receiver first. That's the emphasis of the sentence. Also, it's obvious what is doing the action, so maybe it's not necessary to talk about the doer if it's obvious who is doing the action. And the other reason is that it's unknown what or who is doing the action. So for those three reasons, we put the emphasis of the sentence on the receiver and not the doer, and that's why we use the passive voice. Alright, very good. So, let's look at our grammar when we're describing a process. For example, how do you make gallo pinto? What are the steps? So there are many steps when we make gallo pinto, but maybe the first step, and maybe the most important step, is this, that you cook the beans. Now this sentence is in the active voice because I'm using you, and that's the doer, because the doer cooks the beans, and the beans are the receiver. They're receiving this action. But I don't want to use the active voice. I want to use the passive voice for process because, well, first, I don't need to talk about who does this. I don't need to talk about the person. I want to talk about the beans. I want to talk about the process. So, for example, the beans are cooked. And this is the passive voice because I begin with my receiver, the beans, and then I use my passive voice conjugation. I use be in the plural form and past participle cooked. The beans are cooked. That's the passive voice. Good. Now, to emphasize the importance of an action in a process, use a modal. So basically, I'm asking, is this action important? The beans are cooked. Is this extremely important when I want to make gallo pinto? Of course it is. It's extremely important. It's absolutely necessary. And I can express that emphasis using a modal. So for example, the beans must be cooked. Okay? They must be cooked. So I'm using my modal must to emphasize the importance of the action, that cooking the beans is very necessary, and must is like a obligation, it's mandatory. Okay? So, let's look at some other modals that function the same way to emphasize the passive voice. For example, I have these mandatory verbs, for example, must and need or needs to, have to, and have got to. Those are all very mandatory, like an obligation, like you do not have a choice, right? But I also have should and may, and those are more like a good idea. So we have different options to express ourselves and what we want to emphasize and the way we want to emphasize it. But remember, the passive voice uses the receiver first, then the modal, then be, and the past participle. Now, I am always, when I use a modal, I always use be because after these modal verbs, we always use a base form verb. Always. So be is the base form verb. Okay? So, if I want to be emphasizing how important it is to cook the beans, I can say the beans must be cooked, or the beans need to be cooked. If it's a good idea, I can say, well, the beans should be cooked, but in this context, it's absolutely necessary, so the beans must be cooked is an example. Okay, so those are the different modals that we can use. Very good. So let's practice. So how to make gallo pinto? Well, the first thing we said, we remember, is that the beans need to be cooked. Okay? The modal, be, and the past participle. Very good. Next is the rice. So, the rice has to be made. Again, the modal has to be in the base form and my past participle made. Very good. Okay, the onion and the pepper, right? The vegetables, we'd say the onion and the pepper have got to be cut and cooked. So there's my modal, have got to, using the base form of be. The past participle of cut is cut, and the past participle cooked. Okay, the next step, mix. So the beans and rice must be mixed with the vegetables. Again, the modal and the conjugation for the passive voice. And the very last step in our process for making gallo pinto, the most important thing, right, is that the Lozano sauce should be added. But again, some people don't add Lozano sauce, so this is a reason why I said should, right? It's more of a recommendation, not mandatory. Lozano sauce should be added. Very good. Alright guys, so just remember to describe a process in the passive voice, we start with the receiver, for example the beans. It's an option. We can use a modal if we want to emphasize, but we always use be and the past participle in the passive voice. Very good. Alright guys, thanks for watching and good